Moving on to the cabinet, you'll notice it has 5 main materials. The first one being the corrugated glass, and this is going to be a soft sandblasted glass material on a corrugated mesh. If we get a little zoom of the mesh, the mesh itself is pretty simple. It's all polygonal. There is no SDS here. It doesn't need to be too highly detailed. I'm not using it. I could have used a displacement. I'm not. Having it as polygonal will speed up my renders, and the polygon count isn't that bad. There's going to be metal frames holding the glass door. So if we hide that, the metal frames, and then there's already the silver aluminum that's already been surfaced from before. Now you'll notice there's a few egg-like structures in there, and they're orange. Basically, the whole point of having them is to see something behind the glass, the corrugated glass material. So before we move on, we need to also add a few lights inside the cabinet, and that will help me see the cabinet from the inside a bit more and determine if the glass material is good enough for this object. So the first thing you want to do is add a point light. And move this point light into position towards the back of the cabinet on one side, and then lift it to here. We're going to instance this and move it to the left. We're going to duplicate the instance, which is basically adding another instance to the scene. Bring it down, duplicate again, and bring it down. This will give me 4 lights. Oops. 4 lights for my scene. And what we want to do is bring that down from 3 to 0.5. Okay. Once we're done with that, let's move on to the shaders. Go to corrugated glass material. Let's first of all pick a nice light gray color. We've got a 0.8, 0.8, 0.8. Drag down the diffuse amount to 25%. Go to the material trans, and drag the transparency up to 75%, and the index of refraction to 1.44. Now, usually for glass, we use a transparent amount of 100% and a diffuse amount of 0, and that'll really speed things up. But having a little bit of diffuse and bringing the transparency down to 75 gives it a little bit of more of a milky look to it. If you feel that that's not what you want, you can decrease the diffuse amount down to 0 and bring the transparent amount to 100. And the less the transparent amount and the more the diffuse amount is, the more milky and plasticky it's going to look. Okay. Another reason for giving that little bit of a milky color is because once I add my very high frequency noise, it'll actually be able to hide some of that contrast of the bump on it. So let's move on to the materials. The reflection amount, let's bring that to 4%, and the frontal to 80. Now, depending on the actual glass, you might need those reflections to be blurred, but in our case, the blurred reflection side is on the inside. Therefore, we don't need that to be turned on. We're going to give it its own shader. Okay, and we're going to drag that shader up above the base shader. And this is going to help me with issues of the glass and some speed up times for the render. So we're not going to cast shadows, and we're not going to receive shadows, and we're not going to be visible to indirect rays. Okay, that's because I don't really care for the shadows going into the cabinet or the shadows falling on the transparent glass. Finally, let's add a noise layer. We're going to zero out the position, and we're going to scale it to a very small 0.1. We'll change the widget to equal to 0.1 millimeter, which is 100 UM. Okay. And you'll start noticing some of that noise, maybe not so much right now, but if we do a render test for this, using render region and render is almost a must when you're doing things that have fine noise on them, so you'll be able to see what you're doing. The eye view is just not going to be enough to clear that up. So you'll notice right now it's not that bad. There's not a lot of noise here. What we want to do is clear it up to make it as smooth as possible. We're going to do a render region test to fix up the anti-aliasing settings as well as the shading rate once this is done. There we go. Okay, so drag a render region. This is good enough for us. Let's change the shader rate from 1 to 0.1. Do a test render so we can have a comparison chart, basically. So the difference between shading rate of 1, shading rate of 0.1, it's done a little bit of work. Now if we change the settings on anti-aliasing from 8, let's jump up to 16, actually just 32. Let's make it significant. And you'll see that this is also a really good way of clearing up some of that noise. So if I hop back, you'll see some of the noise in the eggs and around their reflections. If we go back to 32, you can also go up to 64. Now we don't need to render the entire scene under 64. What we could do is render the entire scene at 8 samples per pixel, then proceed to create a render region just around my cabinet and basically the blurred refraction area. And then we can render that at 64. We'll have to do some post work, and we'll be able to separate the glass from the surroundings and comp it onto the scene. And this would be a good time to, organize things for this. So here we go at 64. So this is at 32. This is a shading rate of 1, and this is what I started off with. So if I jump in, you'll see that there is a huge amount of difference between them. Okay, so deselect, let's go to the item list and organize anything we have. Let's grab our point lights and Control G, and we'll call this corrugated cabinet lights, and save this as shot cabinet. Did I save that in the right place? Nope. Here we go. So the remaining materials we have is the aluminum, which has already been done here. You can see it already in the reflections inside the cabinet. So that leaves us with the metal frames and the cabinet doors. So let's select the cabinet steel frames. And we're just going to right click, load preset. We're going to use the metal rough preset here. There we go, metal 2. Drag it up, get rid of the old group, the preset group and the old material. Delete, go to the metal, and uncheck blurry reflections. I just don't need to see blurry reflections behind the already blurred refractions of the corrugated material. That's just going to increase render time and introduce more noise problems in my render. Moving on to the material of cabinet doors. The all-new hot pink doors. We're going to have this as a black vinyl material. It's going to be dark, semi-glossy, but it's going to have a fine bump map. So the first thing you want to do is change the color to a dark gray. So we've got a 0.1 on that all. Change the reflections to 5% and 25% on the frontal. I'm going to change the camera angle just to get a better view of the reflective properties of this material. There we go. I want to be able to see those windows reflecting. And let's add an image. It's going to be our bump image. And we're going to add wood 01 bump. Okay, turn off anti-aliasing. Go to texture locator and choose the UV map of cabinet glass. You'll see that everything should be set up in the right direction. If I take a navigation look here. So the grain of the wood has been correctly done through use of the UV map. If we go to the UV map, I can see all of my cabinet doors. Go back to render. And since we're using vinyl, we are using the UV map and not a planar projection like we did for the counter. The cabinet has a vinyl siding. Basically, it's just a skin that's been stuck on to the sides of the cabinet doors. Okay, let's decrease the layer opacity to 5% and make it into a bump. And you'll see it's already broken up my reflections here. Now I don't like the sizing, so we're going to change the UV map horizontal wrap to 5 on both vertical and horizontal. That looks pretty good. Now I'm afraid the fine bump might actually give us render problems or artifacts. It just won't be smooth enough. So I'm going to also give it its own shader just as well. Now this doesn't have to go to 0.1, just go to 0.2. And let's do a small render. Actually, we can stop this. For 5, I just need a little area in the middle. That looks pretty good. Let's take it up to 1.0 just to show you the difference between the renders. So this is 1. Oh, gotta take this above the base shader. So this is 1. And now if I do it at 0.2, which is what I wanted to do, you'll notice it's a much finer result. Okay, so we're done for the cabinet. You can turn off the corrugated cabinet. Let's rename that something correctly. Cabinet lights, no need for that anymore. Lose the render region and save.